And we're live. Hello, Asia.
Yay. Hey, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. Uh Thrilled to have you. Thank you for making the time. I'm so excited for this.
Yes.
I mean, like Rand and I are mostly content marketers, right? Like we're marketing generalists, but in our hearts, we are content marketers. So super excited to have your perspective as someone who is like in the weeds of early stage growth. Super helpful perspective, and I think one that a lot of people are really excited to learn from.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much again. There's so many just like little juicy tidbits that I can't wait to share. It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
Hopefully a few spicy things for marketers to take away.
Ooh. And we'll see. So, friends in the live chat, those who are tuning in, where are you tuning in from? Hey, Janet, welcome. I'm in LA. Mo's here. All right, we have more friends coming in.
Ooh,
Sean, Gabriel, good to see you all. Cool. We usually have a pretty distributed audience, so it's exciting. Ooh, John is from
nice.
Glasgow. Austin, Seattle. Good to
Ooh,
see you all,
Toronto.
friends.
Oh, there they all come in.
All
Awesome.
right. Bring the spice.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Meredith. So Asia, like, I feel like I don't know how long we've known each other. I guess past year. Like we met on Twitter or like,
Mhm.
you know, like officially met at Spark Together last fall.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
before that, messaged or like DM'd on Twitter and like chatted one-on-one there.
Yeah.
How did you meet Rand? Have you been friends for a long time?
I love this question because um I have known of Rand for forever, but we actually only officially met in person for the first time last year at a founder retreat in Italy. And I actually so the story goes, Rand actually knew of me through Twitter and LinkedIn.
Mhm.
I've known of Rand though since like early Moz. Like right around when they started really doubling down on SEO and they were teaching the world about SEO. And I remember watching his like whiteboard Fridays and I was like, baby marketer at the time, like learning about all this stuff. And this was when companies were really like figuring out, oh my God, digital marketing, websites, the internet, like this is the place to be. And I've just like kept up with him over the years, but I've never actually met him. I never once had a conversation with him. It wasn't until after I had joined the board of Moz, which for context, I actually took Rand's seat. So when Rand stepped down from the board, I actually took Rand's seat on the board as an official board member. And we had sold the company and like it had gotten acquired and like the whole thing. And I never actually met Rand until like in person until after all of that, which is so wild. But Rand actually reached out to me. He reached out to me, gosh, it was 2020, maybe 2021. He slid into my DMs on Twitter and was like, I've been a huge fan for a long time. And I was like blown away because I was like, what? You're a fan of me? I'm a fan of you. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
you like taught me all the things. Um and yeah, it was so surreal. But he literally slid into my DMs and was like, hey, I think you're amazing and I've been following you for a long time. I have an opportunity you can't refuse. And I was like, I don't know what it is, but it's yes. I was like, I don't even care. It's yes. And that's how it all started. And so I joined the board officially in, I think, 2021. And yeah, 6 months later, it was a acquisition process. But yeah, it was wild. And then we officially met last year for the first time ever. Of course, we've had
What?
conversations, but like in person, first time ever last year. And hopefully, we'll see each other pretty soon.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like that's the story.
That's amazing. I thought you've been friends for a long time because you're on the board of Moz. I don't know. I just assume that you were
It
long time. You go way
Rand is one
back.
of those people where like you like it just feels like you've known him for forever, and that's exactly how I feel about Rand. Like I just feel like I've always known him, and in a way I kind of did in a parasocial way.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
But yes, like it was like we were always like long friends. And I actually remember, so before he ever reached out about the board opportunity, I distinctly remember reading his book, or I was listening to his book, Lost and Founder. This was before I was like very early running DemandMaven, which is the company I'm running now. And I remember
Mhm.
listening to his book, and I was waiting at the Peachtree Station MARTA like train stop. And I remember thinking, man, Rand sounds really cool. It'd be really awesome to meet him in person. And
Yeah.
little did I know, like the universe had much bigger plans in store for me with that. But yeah, it was cool.
That's amazing. Oh my god.
Small
And
world.
that's, like, true about Rand, like, when you meet him, it's like you're meeting an old friend for the first time. It just
Yes,
is. Yeah.
totally.
That's so fun. Um, all right. Well, I think we still have more people coming in. Cool. Um, super excited for today. So, friends, those who are just tuning in and joining, Asia Orangio is joining us to teach us all about growth, like finding underleveraged opportunities, organic opportunities, and how we use to uncover new opportunities for growth. So, as we get into that, I'm going to do a proper intro because that's what we do here. All right. So, our guest for today, our guest presenter, is a longtime digital marketer and demand generation marketer. She's been a mentor at Tiny Seed, at Growth Mentor, and TechStars for several years now. And she's also the founder and CEO of a company called DemandMaven. DemandMaven helps founders of early stage startups get their first 100 customers. So she is our expert in all things growth, and our dear SparkToro friend, Asia Orangio, everyone.
Thank you so much. All right. So I am just going to jump right in.
Yeah,
Uh, okay. I think you can
there
see
we
my
go.
screen. Cool. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. We have a bunch to cover, and I'm already
Oh,
kind of like, oh,
I should interject. I'm sorry. No,
no. Yeah.
I usually get into the housekeeping stuff, which I
Oh,
forgot to do.
no. That's okay. Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay, so friends, most of you, I think, are familiar with how we do SparkToro office hours. Participate in the live chat. We'd love to see your reactions there. Sometimes it helps to drop in some quick notes, reactions to things. You can also drop in your questions there. I'll be monitoring it. Asia has a presentation to get through. She might see it. But well, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and stuff. If you want to like live tweet or live post in social media, our hashtag is SparkToro Hours. Let's drop it in the chat. Oh, it's Atlas's first office hours. Welcome, Atlas.
Awesome. Welcome.
Um, yeah. And of course, after this, the recording will be available on this very page. So you'll see it, you'll see the replay there. I will also send I'll send a recap email, hopefully with the blog post of this ready. We'll have the recording and the slides, if it's okay with Asia. Why I
Yeah.
didn't ask first. um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah. So friends, with that, I will stop interrupting Asia and we'll get started.
No, no worries. I'm already like, oh man, anytime you prepare a talk, there's always like there's a few different paths that you can take. And already I'm like, oh, there's all these other cool paths that we could take. But I'll save it for the end because I actually do have a few extra slides just in case. But anyway, okay.
Cool.
Okay, we're gonna jump right in. So the premise for this talk is of course, that acquisition just is not like what it used to be. If you are a marketer, if you're in product marketing, if you are a founder, um, acquisition is it is consistently uh, changing, and there's always new channels, there's always new things. I mean, if you think about like the dot-com days, very very early, um, I was talking about meeting Rand for the first time ever, but before that, when SEO was like the new and wild thing, then of course we get into all the different digital channels. We start seeing companies like Google, Facebook, now Meta, Twitter, et cetera, start to take hold. And then we also start to see this huge boom in terms of content marketing and all the different various ways and things that you can acquire customers and reach customers. And this is uh, non-traditional media, but then there's also traditional media. There's still technically TV ads, billboards, things like that, print media, magazines. When it comes to the channels that are available to marketers these days, it is extremely wide and ever expanding. And I didn't include anything about AI today in today's talk, but even now I'm actually seeing like people are using AI in a way that's also really interesting. when it comes to acquisition and also growth in general. But anyway, I'm going to bookmark that in case there's any questions about it. But when it comes to the history of all of this, our options have certainly expanded, but the costs have also increased. This is a study that is done, or that was done by a company that I really admire and respect called Profitwell. I'm actually going to use a lot of their research today. But something that they noticed was over the past, let's say, 7 to 8 years, customer acquisition costs has actually increased significantly. This is a chart from B2B versus B2C. And this was actually conducted, I believe, in, I think it says, it either says 2018 or 2019 down there. I can't actually see it because my screen is super minimized. But what you need to know from this chart is there's been a 60% increase in cost to acquire companies for paid acquisition. And there's been a 70% increase in cost to acquire customers for both B2B and B2C. So this is not unique or special to one versus the other. What we're seeing is CAC is rising just across the board. It's getting more and more expensive to acquire customers. The study in particular was actually done to focus on subscription based companies. So if you had subscription D2C, subscription software, subscription, like, whatever type of company. So I do want to add the caveat that those are stats specific to subscription companies, but what we're seeing is this is actually happening across the board, no matter what kind of organization you are in. It's just getting more expensive. And yes, the inflation, Rand, you mentioned inflation. Rand is in the chat. Hey, Rand. 100%. It's actually kind of wild to see how these things are correlated. And then, of course, we start looking at different mediums. So it's not just B2B versus B2C, but we're also seeing that the cost to acquire customers is increasing across different formats, different strategies across marketing, from content marketing to paid acquisition. What's interesting is that video and podcast customer, or CAC, is much lower overall. But when you think about the others that are more scalable, and put that in finger quotes, like, it's easier to turn on a paid ads campaign. It's easier to pump out content than maybe it is to pump out like video or podcast content. Cost there, the investment there is different, but overall, these are increasing as well over time. What we're seeing is that there's also a 40% increase in CAC for content marketing as well. And this is overall probably not shocking. Like, I think we all collectively as marketers feel this. But I think the implication here, though, is that the bottom line is that it's just more expensive than ever to acquire customers. It just is. And so what we as marketers have to do is we have to figure out ways that we can not just decrease the cost, but also how can we still build meaningful relationships with customers, still acquire customers, and ultimately provide value to them, find them, provide value to them, and do it in a way that meets them on their level, that isn't annoying, but is actually valuable, while still also keeping respect to our budgets. And when I think about growth, acquisition is just one part of that. In this talk, we're going to talk about the acquisition side, but we're also going to talk about a few of the other opportunities that you might not expect based off of the process that we're going to go through today. And lucky for you, I'm going to give you away some of my absolute best secrets here. I'm going to show you literally what we do on DemandMaven side when we work with our clients and how to do this work, finding growth opportunities, and even more specifically, finding growth opportunities in acquisition. Okay, so the first thing I want to give you guys is, okay, so it's getting harder than ever to acquire customers. It's just more expensive than ever. There's also, depending on your industry, tons and tons and tons of things that we compete with in terms of attention. Depending on your market, you may be up against several competitors. If you're not in a market where you're up against tons of competitors, you're up against tons of competing alternatives or behaviors. So what I'm going to propose that we start with first is, okay, agnostic of channel, what if we started with finding the influence? And finding the influence is essentially just figuring out like who or what ultimately motivates or inspires your customer target today. There's tons of channels. A lot of them are very expensive. So what are the ones that we can find that are within the budget, maybe something that we wouldn't have considered before, but also, of course, influences and inspires people? When I say influences, I'm not talking about influencers. I just want to make that really clear. Can it include influencers? Yes, but influences go beyond specific people. It goes also into like the environments that ultimately influence people. So I'm not looking for, okay, who are all the influencers out in this space? I'm looking for influences. What ultimately, like, what are the places, people, things that inspire, motivates customers? And that could be, we often see this, especially in B2B, but colleagues, workplaces. There's also, there's friends, there's, of course, social media channels, but there's also, yes, sure, thought leaders in particular spaces. Um, but there's also like conferences, associations, resources, places that these like that ultimately customers gather and people gather, share ideas, share knowledge, and be inspired, be motivated, and ultimately get influence from. So when I say influences, I'm really more speaking to that, not necessarily purely influencers, which is obviously like specifically people. So influences, but that's what we're looking
Yeah.
for.
Super appreciate the distinction here, Asia. I mean, we hear this and we hear about this a lot at SparkToro, but also just as marketers, we often hear about and talk about influencers, which is yeah, can be a really important or impactful channel, but it's also not thinking big enough, right? It's not even just it's like yeah, you might have an influencer strategy, but that's distinctly different from the influence strategy. Like where and what are the sources of influence? To your point, events could be podcasts, could be uh could be subject matter experts in the niche who
Mhm.
wouldn't self-identify as like creators, even who are people who are just like I just do my job, right? But those are also the people that you want to get in front of. So just really appreciate the call out for identifying these sources of influence specifically.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, and I like it. It ties into the next slide, which is this. There's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance, I'll say, between what we think ultimately influences people versus what actually influences people. And when it comes down to influence, what I love about this chart is for most people, for most buyers out there, whether it's B2B or B2C, most buyers are influenced ultimately at the end of the day by other people. And they're also influenced, we call it word of mouth as a channel, which is a very, very tough channel to measure. I've seen all kinds of ways to do this, and sometimes even harder to attribute. But when we think about word of mouth ultimately happens in places and spaces. We do not have like product recommendations incepted into our minds, although I'm sure we're not too far away from that at some point. But there's like, we hear about product recommendations all the time from others. What I think is so interesting about this chart, though, is that there's this cognitive dissonance between what marketers believe versus what customers actually experience. And it turns out word of mouth is still one of the top channels, but word of mouth is really tough because it's one of those things like where you are like, I can't really predict when or if this is going to happen. But I would actually argue there are ways to not like necessarily, I guess not literally insert yourself in the conversation, but there's ways to enter into environments where if you have an incredible product, if you have a great incredible service, there's ways to enter in and be a participant of these spaces and places where this type of influence happens. Um, so we conduct a ton of customer research, and I am definitely going to talk about audience research and customer research today. We conduct research where we talk to customers, we talk to audience members, and one of the questions that we always ask is, what are some of the places that you hang out? We will also ask, how did you find this specific product? Like, how did you hear about SparkToro, or how did you hear about Loom, or how did you hear about whatever? And by far and away, one of the most common channels that everyone says is some version of word of mouth. It's either colleagues, referrals, friends. It's people. It's basically people saying, "Hey, I have this problem. What do you recommend?" "Oh, I've used this or I've seen this in the past." And that is the just top channel that we see. The second most common channel that we see is Google. So search SEO still very much a perfectly viable channel, although we will see that, obviously it's getting more and more challenging to start to rank. And I don't not yet. My brain's not ready. But when it comes to word of mouth, it's still like these are the spaces and places that this happens. So how do we actually find the influences if we're like on board with, okay, it's yes, like channels are important, but again, if we were to think beyond just purely a channel, let's think into influences. So like, where are the places that influence actually happens? How do we find them? So controversial yet brave. It's going to be part customer research. And really good friend of mine, also someone I really respect and admire in the growth and marketing sphere, is Caitlin Burgoyne. And something that she says, she actually wrote this killer article about this, which I've linked to in this slide. But she made the argument a few years ago that customer research is probably one of the most crucial growth hacks that you can possibly do, and yet it is considered extremely unsexy. It's and so unsexy that like most people don't do it. Most people don't necessarily have the resources to do it, so that's obviously a different scenario. But when we think about customer research, it's quite. I think it's just, to me, it is like one of the most fruitful things that you can possibly do in your organization, and yet considered very widely unpopular because and there's something about it that like is either intimidating or there's like a lack of resources or time to do this. But I highly recommend you read the article that she wrote, that I've linked here. It's absolutely incredible. If I can't convince you today to do customer research, hopefully this article will. But there's tons of studies and research that shows that customer research actually is hugely important for us, and it is incredible for businesses. When it comes to figuring out what those channels are, customer research is huge, and I'm going to talk through, of course, how you can do this on your own. But there are studies that show that we should be doing this. So 54% greater return on marketing investment for teams that do customer research. This was actually a stat from the Aberdeen group, I believe. There's also a stat from the same study that says that teams that do customer research see an 18 times faster sales cycle. They also tend to see 3.5x greater revenue from customer referrals, again, getting into that word of mouth piece. There's 56% more cross-sell and upsell revenue. So this is cross-selling other services or products. And then this is a different stat or a different study also by Profitwell, but this is probably my favorite one. Teams that do at least 10 or so customer interviews per month tend to grow 2 to 3 times faster than teams that don't, which is absolutely insane. That is the difference between $1 million ARR and 3 million ARR, or 10 million ARR and 30 million ARR. Like, you get the idea. And probably one of my favorite stats ever. But all of this is because of just interviews, just talking to customers. Now, I hate to say like just talking to customers is the answer for everything. There is obviously a process that we have to go through to do this, which I will cover a little bit today. But even just talking to customers about will just be massively impactful for you guys. The other stat that I want to give you, and this is also from Profitwell, but 80% of you who are listening to me spread the gospel of customer research, 80% of you won't actually do it. So the 20% of you who will consider customer research, the next few slides are definitely for you. But what I love about this stat, though, is it just kind of goes to show that customer research is huge. I'm going to also give you ways, though, that if you can't directly talk to customers, that you can still get insight and information, but hopefully still enables you to get you what you need, so that way you can continue to find acquisition opportunity, but then also other opportunities outside of just purely acquisition. Okay, so talking to customers is how we understand influences, not just influencers, but influences. And I think to boil it down and make it super easy, because talking to customers is really intimidating. I would be the first one to admit that. So you really don't need hundreds of interviews. You don't need dozens. You actually just need 10. You need 10 interviews from your ideal paying customer, or from the customer segment that you're focused on. So let's say you target agencies. You want 10 interviews from that particular segment of agencies. Let's say you're targeting, double income, no kids, couples in the United States, less than some salary amount. You want to speak to 10 folks in that arena. The next, you want to ask what are called jobs to be done style questions. I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time on jobs to be done today, but jobs to be done style questions are they are questions that get at the context of why someone has purchased something, as opposed to maybe more like demographic information. And I'm going to give you examples of like literally what to ask. But you want to specifically ask jobs to be done style questions. And then finally, you want to record your interviews if at all possible. If you're having an interview on Zoom, ask for permission to record it. If you're meeting in person, bring a recorder. Most smartphones have a recorder. you just want to record your interview. And part of this is because, well, one, you want to transfer it to other team members because that voice of customer data will be massively helpful for other team members as well, but also because it will help you eliminate as much bias as you possibly can. Reading a transcript of an interview is a very different experience than running the interview. And it's also a very different experience than actually listening to a recording of the interview. And you want to give yourself the benefit of all three of those mediums if you can, of running it live and or participating, listening to a recording, and even potentially like reading a transcript. All very different, and also different people pick up on different things. So you as a marketer might hear something very different than a salesperson. And this is also why recording the interview is so critical. But you just need 10. You don't need dozens. I know it might seem like you need like hundreds of interviews for the data to be relevant, but you actually just need 10 to get information, to get insight. And I would even say if you can't do 10, even 3 to 4 would be very powerful for you to do. And we're also going to talk about, obviously, like if you can't do interviews, what are some other ways that you can get some data? Because obviously, qualitative insight from customers is huge, but ideally, we're going for interviews. Okay, so I mentioned ask jobs to be done style questions, and I wish we had enough time to go into jobs because it is so powerful as a framework. But I'm just going to give you like literally like these are the questions that we ask, and this is how we ultimately find acquisition opportunity, but also other growth opportunities. We will ask, of course, the obvious, like, hey, how did you find, insert your company name here. So, hey, how did you find DemandMaven? But we'll also ask what was going on in your world that led you to look for the product or solution. And this is a contextual question. And the context here is what were they doing or what was going on? Like, what were they experiencing when they were like, I got to find something. I got to do something different. I can't keep living like this. Or sometimes it's not a pain that they're trying to solve as much as like a desire, where they desire something specific and there was some context that was happening around them. The context is important. It might not seem like there's growth opportunity there, but there 100% is, because if you can understand the context, you can also build campaigns around that. You can potentially build content around that. Like there's so much that you can do if you understand the context of like what's going on. What were you using or doing before? This is a critical one. So what were they using before your solution or your product? What were they doing before using your solution or product? Sometimes they're not using like a competitor, but they're like there's like a behavior that they were doing instead. It's also helpful for context. How did you find out about the product? So this is very similar, of course, to finding out about your product, but how do they find about the competitor, basically, if there is a competitor or a competing alternative? This is one of my favorites because you'd be surprised at the answers you get. What are some places that you hang out online? Like, what are some places that you hang out online? Some you'll get like, oh, LinkedIn, or I'll check Twitter, but sometimes you'll get really specific stuff. Like I read CMO Today every day. Like you'll just get all kinds of really interesting things when you ask this question. And then when you want to learn more about your industry or your role, where do you go? This is probably my favorite question out of all of them. Actually, maybe the second and the last one are my favorites. When you want to learn more about your role, your industry, where do you go? If it's industry, you'll hear a plethora of things. And if it's role, you'll also potentially hear a plethora of things as well. And what I love about this question is it tackles both sides. There are some folks who their role has its world, and their industry obviously has a whole entire other world. A great example is I was working with, or I was talking to a company that they sell to janitors in airports and hospitals. And when you think about the role of janitor and also the industry of airports, think about how completely different those areas of life are and the channels. So I love this question because it really paints a picture of where someone might go based off of context or implication. We ask about industry and role, but if you think about like B2C use cases, obviously this is more a B2B example, but B2C can also, like there's tons of opportunity from a B2C perspective because we wear so many different hats. There's just so many different hats that we wear. So I love this question, and you can adjust it to kind of fit whatever context you would like to expand or understand.
That's an amazing question. I think it'll also give you additional information on how people use different channels. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there might be people, and I'm making this up, who say like, oh, I go to Instagram to learn more about my role, and how I can be a really good individual. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible for them to learn about their industry on Instagram, but it just speaks to how they use a given channel or platform and what they get most out of it. So it gives you
Mhm.
additional clues of, sure, publications to follow and stuff, but also helps you understand how your ideal customer might be thinking through the different kinds of social media channels or publications or just content platforms that are available to them. So,
Yes,
yeah.
100%. You nailed it. Yes, it gives you a sense for, I mean, I don't know if it would make sense to do this, but you could literally map out the hierarchy of what people pay attention to when and why. And also, I like, so my favorite follow-up question to this is, "Oh, well, why? Why do you go to that place versus this place?" And you'll also be amazed at what kind of information you get from people as well. And
Yeah.
this is again why I will spread the gospel of interviews, like actually talking to folks. But there are ways that, of course, you can get more asynchronously, which we
Oh
have a
gosh,
section
yeah.
on that as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, and also
So
just like you'll get people who are like, "Oh, yeah, I get this particular information on Twitter," which I only check Twitter when I'm in between tasks, or like when I leave my computer to do this other thing, right? Or there's people
mhm.
who were like, "Yeah, I get my information from these podcasts, which I only listen to when I'm driving." Right? So you
Yeah.
understand the use cases and then once you get those use cases, right? If you're thinking about, okay, so they get their industry news from podcasts while they're driving. So also they're probably not taking a lot of notes because they're driving, right? So they're probably thinking about these things like in themes or like in broad strokes and how they can internalize that and use that, to get better at their job. So it
Mhm.
gives you so much information about not only how they consume content, but also how they retain it and like, yeah, the way that they're internalizing it.
I'll share a very quick story about
Mhm.
how something like this can be massively helpful for acquisition. But I was working with a company a long time ago, and they were in the medical space, and they were targeting hospitals,
Mhm.
and more specifically, oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the exact title, but I want to say it
Mhm.
was like practice directors, people who were in charge of compliance for the different equipment and materials that different sections of the hospital will leverage and use. And that often falls to someone who is like an operations role, but also like they'll tend to do like a million things, and they're never at their phones. And at the time, the company was considering building out a desktop experience. But after doing this research, we discovered that that actually might not make as much sense. Like maybe we need a desktop experience, but maybe we don't put all of our eggs in that basket. Maybe we actually focus instead on a mobile app. And that was a very huge breakthrough moment for the company because they were about to go all in on this desktop experience. But when we did research, we learned that like these people are never at their desks, like ever. They
Yeah.
are on the go, running a mile a minute. They need this app to be amazing, fast. Like they need an app, one, and then two, they need it to be amazing and fast. And like it needs to be like it needs to have an incredible UI, and which is deceptive because it seems like everyone always kind of is like, oh, that doesn't seem like that would be like a bad UI until like you actually experience it on the go, and then you're like, oh wow, this
Mhm.
has so many problems. But anyway, um, so yes, that context of like when people listen to what or what they do, like why they're doing it then versus now or whatever, that gives you a sense for even how to like frame your ad or frame
Mhm.
your campaign or frame your content that you're about to create. That's why I love this.
Yeah.
But yes, good point.
Yeah. Oh, we do have a question in the chat that
Oh,
maybe we can address
yes.
here as it's relevant
Everything
from
apply.
Sean. Does everything
Mhm.
apply when interviewing prospective customers versus existing or past customers?
Yes. So interviewing prospects versus existing or past customers. So if you're looking at active customers, potential customers, and then maybe churned customers, the questions that you ask will differ and vary. And I don't want to say like the way that you weight them is different. It's just much more like you're going to get different types of information from different folks. Prospects in general, if they're not already customers, they're going to be you're going to want to ask them just different questions because they're not going to be able to tell you like why your product is amazing or why your service is amazing or anything like that because they're not customers yet. But you could certainly with a prospect you could dig very deep into their decision making process. You could dig very deep into like what they compared your product or service to, what channels they leveraged. And that's better for a prospect in a way because you actually understand more, like they're going to remember more of it. But I would keep in mind though that for prospects, you just have to be careful because if they're not actually going to be great customers, it's not that that information doesn't matter as much as like you just want to like take it with a grain of salt because
Mm.
if you look entirely at prospects, the same thing is actually true for churned customers. Like not all of the customers that come through the journey or the life cycle are going to be great customers that you like want to actually acquire more of. So it's important to keep in mind that it's certainly cyclical and you'll need to be strategic about what weight you give to prospects versus churned customers and even also active customers. But just keep in mind though that with prospects, I would ask tons of acquisition questions. But keeping in mind though that if they're not great customers in the end, then obviously you want to go back to that research and kind of decide. And then the same thing is true for churned. Although I will say for churned customers, if you can get them to talk to you, that's amazing. It's really hard to get people who churn to talk to you after they've churned. Hopefully, if there's like a really good customer relationship that you guys had over the years or whatever it is, then you actually can get them to talk to you and like discuss all kinds of things. You can certainly talk about, like why they churned, but you can also discuss maybe what channels they came through or like what impression they had and of the product or the service, aka like does your messaging need to change, like that kind of thing. But all that to say, you certainly could just make sure that you're strategic when you go through that process, but you absolutely can. Cool. Okay, so what if you can't get customer interviews? If you can't get customer interviews, there's a couple of things that you can do depending on budget and bandwidth and also technical ability. Userinterviews.com is one of my absolute favorite places to go if you don't have customers that you can talk to, but you know what your target segments are. And this will require some budget, but user interviews basically is a massive database of people who you can pay to interview. You can also pay to have certain types of folks complete your surveys and also test product, review websites. Like there's all kinds of things that you can get users to do. But it's important to remember that you will likely, assuming that your company is not like a household name brand, you will likely be talking to audience members, people who are not literally customers, but who fit your profile. And if that's the case, you want to ask questions that obviously steer away from like why you chose our product because they're not customers of your product. But you do want to ask them about, again, the contextual stuff, like what channels do you use? Why do you use them? But also, have you ever thought, like, do you struggle with this particular challenge? If you do, tell me more about that. That challenge, of course, would correlate to what your product or your service ultimately solves. There's all kinds of amazing things that you can do with userinterviews.com. And there's like probably a whole talk I can give about how to use this tool because it's a very powerful one. But if you don't have access to customers, but you have a little bit of budget, you could absolutely use this and talk to people. There's also the option to collect more passive voice of customer, and this would require a little bit of savvy on the marketing side, of course, when it comes to any lead gen forms or demand generation forms that you have for any lead magnets or anything that people can sign up for. You can add just one extra question. You don't want to ask like a million questions here, but you can just do one extra question for forms on lead magnets. It could be something very simple. So if you want to get more data about attribution / maybe channels that are working, you might ask like how did you hear about us? And you can either do a drop down or an open text field. But if you do an open text field, you got to make sure you actually analyze it later. But you can also do questions like, hey, what are some questions that you hang out online? And you can do a drop down, but you can also do an open text. I recommend teams, if there's a challenge with getting customer interviews, I say, okay, let's figure out how we can either collect passive data or use audience research or both. But passive data, like these are just some examples. There's tons of other ways that you can collect passive voice of customer. You've got to be, again, strategic here because you don't want to add a million questions to forms that are actually important for your funnel. And you also don't want to ask questions on forms where you really need the conversion and you don't want to slow down the conversion rate. But there are certainly opportunities where you can do this and it wouldn't like impact your conversion rates like too wild and crazy. But yeah, there's tons of different ways that you can apply this. One of my absolute favorite ways to also collect just passive VOC is to include a follow-up question on any automated emails. So one of my favorite examples is let's say you have control over onboarding emails or onboarding or activation sequences. So whenever someone signs up for a free trial or someone signs up or downloads a product or something, there's that automated email that gets kicked back. That's like, hey, thank you so much for signing up, or hey, thank you so much for downloading. And then there's like a link. It would be breaking some email rules because it's technically two calls to action, but you could also say, just curious, just hit reply if you have a response, but just curious, why did you download this material? Or what were you hoping that this ebook would help you accomplish? Or what were you hoping, like, why did you sign up for DemandMaven? Or like, whatever, why did you sign up for SparkToro? Like you could certainly add in questions. You gotta be strategic here. And also totally breaking some calls to action rules. But sometimes it works and it's really massively helpful. One of my favorite examples of this is a really good friend of mine. She is a product consultant and she was working with a very well-known company on basically helping enable the product team and also the marketing team with voice of customer data. And it was a very simple thing that she did, but she changed the onboarding emails to include a question at the end of every email. And all the responses to that question, she would pipe into a Slack channel automatically. And it was as simple as, why did you sign up today? Like, what brings you here? These are more like productivity related questions, but you could ask questions like, hey, when you like, what influences you the most? Or like, where do you go when you want to learn more about this? These are examples. Obviously, we got to be strategic here on how and when we do this. But these are just like different ideas and ways. Like if you can't actually talk to customers, how can you actually get data from them that enables you in some area?
That's cool. So you said so she added the question to the onboarding email, which and the answers piped into a Slack channel. Was that right?
Yes, and the Slack
What?
channel had
Uh-huh.
like the whole team on it.
Uh-huh.
Um,
The whole
and
marketing team or the whole company?
The whole company,
Cool.
everyone saw it. It was actually huge because
Uh-huh.
it gave transparency to everyone all at once, and it was also really
Mhm.
cool too because people could actually react like inside of the Slack channel. Like people could discuss the answers,
Yeah.
and sometimes they would get, depending on the question that was asked, they would get like stuff that they just really were not expecting at all, and then other times they would get tons of responses where they were like, okay, like we're on the right track. Like people
Uh-huh.
are picking up what we're putting down, and that was like very validating for them. But anytime they got like wild stuff, they'd be like, whoa, we gotta learn more about this
Yeah.
and like maybe talk to this person.
That
um
is such a great KPI. Like just to like automate a way to get real-time feedback and see the opportunities to learn more, or even just, or it also gives way like as a morale booster, right? Like people can say like, hey, so, and like, hey Asia, that event you spoke at, like it went really well, like you crushed it, and it's cool to see new customers coming in. Like, it's
yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, it massively impactful. um There's also, there's including, or excuse me, there's analyzing reviews of competitors. Sometimes you can find all kinds of interesting things, especially if you go through the review sites. We have definitely leveraged these before when we couldn't do interviews for various projects. We would analyze like 100 or so reviews of competitors and also like of the existing product, and like, just be surprised at like how much you can find and just learn even from that. Um, and then also, this is kind of like I would only recommend this if like it actually makes sense culturally for your company. But sometimes it's really hard for marketers to even get FaceTime with customers. So I would position your research as a case study instead. I have definitely pulled this one before when it was really hard to get in front of customers, just based off of like just like the culture of how the company worked. And so I would be like, okay, well, if I can't do research, I will do case studies and ask all of my questions in the call that I have with the customer at that point.
Yeah. I
Um,
definitely have done that, because then you could, because like if you're doing, especially if you're doing a thorough job with a case study, you need to learn about the customer pain points. Like what were you doing before that, led you to this solution? And you can kind of dig into that. That's it basically is a customer interview. And it's also like a safe space because they're happy.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And
Yeah.
yes, 100%. But yeah. And then if you can, and this is also like cultural dependent, sometimes again it's just really hard for the marketing team to get FaceTime with customers. So I would recommend, if you're cool with like your salesperson or your customer success team, ask if you can join demos, ask if you can join customer support meetings, and if you can sneak in a question in there, I would go for it. I've definitely been there before. But these are other ways that you can get FaceTime, get insight, get any kind of data that you might need from customers. There was a time where it was really hard to get FaceTime with customers at a company I was working with. And what I would do is I would just sit in on sales demos. I would sit on sales calls. And at the very end, they would always kick it to me for like a question or two. And I would just ask, like, it would seem so inane, but it was so incredibly helpful. And I would literally just be like, okay, like, in your opinion, like, so we're torn between building out videos or building out like written guides for onboarding. And like, what would you prefer? Would you watch videos or would you read guides? And we would like tally up the answers over time. And turns out that people wanted more like video onboarding, but that was how I did it because I couldn't actually get FaceTime with customers. So the only way I could do it was literally on the demo. And I would limit myself to like one or two questions, and it would be like super actionable tactical stuff, but needing their advice, of course. Like, okay, you're customers now. What would you prefer? We're thinking of building this or this. And yeah. So anyway, just in case you can't get any interviews done. Cool. Okay. So here's the spicy part. It's not enough to just like ask these questions. We got to actually measure the answers that we get. And I want to be careful here because it's already a lot to talk to customers and to like even like get FaceTime with them. If you're in an organization where you have like relatively like more control and or power, and like you can like you can basically say, hey, like, I need to talk to customers, let's make it happen, and it actually happens. That's incredible. That's already a lot of work. We have to take it a step further, though. We've actually got to analyze it. And what I mean by that is every to customers on the DemandMaven side, at least. So whenever we work with our clients on interviewing customers and getting growth ideas, we always, always, always actually analyze the data. And there's really fancy ways of doing this, and there's also like very like not fancy ways and like super effective and very valid, and I'll show you both. We pretty much always use Airtable whenever we are analyzing interviews. This is an anonymized database. This data is not real. The voice of a customer is real, but not like the people itself. The On the left side, we have their emails, and then I'm just showing you discovery habits, which is code word for how did they find out about DemandMaven. And there are quotes in here in this Airtable database. And then right next to it, we actually will create tags for the different channel opportunities. And or sometimes we'll hear like, this is just one section of the database, but sometimes we'll hear like suggested improvements, like what can we improve about our DemandMaven service, what have you. And like we will actually tag accordingly to whatever framework it is that we're using. In this particular case, we're talking about what are the influences. When we ask those questions, we actually tally them up, we measure them. There's a number of ways that you can do this, but what we end up with is a chart that looks something like this. And what this does as marketers is it tells us, oh, I maybe need to focus on word of mouth, or maybe we need to focus on this other side, or sometimes you will see that like most people come through a specific channel, but there's other channels that are maybe weaker, and that might trigger you to say, maybe we should focus instead. Like, oh man, Google's going great, but the other stuff isn't as good. Maybe we need to like think about how to improve our presence there and or improve conversion rate or improve volume of leads generated from that particular source. So this is why the measurement is so crucial. But like I said, you don't have to be like Airtable fancy. You can create spreadsheets. Like you can do this inside of spreadsheets. And I believe I have an example. Yeah, I was going to say I have an example of this. Left-hand side is a screenshot of what it looks like in a spreadsheet, but you can create charts inside of Google Sheets. I feel like you can do this in Excel as well, but you can actually like visualize this data that you have accumulated. And spoilers, you should do this for any type of data that you're collecting from customers, not just about discovery channels or channels period, but this can be applied to pretty much any question that you ask. If you are consistent in asking it, you can likely measure the answers. Previous example that I gave, channel opportunities, yeah. So in terms of the question, where do you go when you want to learn more about your industry? Sometimes you get charts that look like this. It's actually a really clean chart where Google's like the top one, like most people will search. But sometimes you will see a chart that has like hundreds of channel opportunities. I just did a research project for a company where we interviewed 50 people, and the channel opportunities chart is like massive. Like there's like hundreds of places for us to go and like explore and do the thing. Um, Hopefully that's not as overwhelming for you. That was actually really inspiring for us because we're like, oh man, there's so much stuff to like go and look at. There's so much room for activities. But sometimes you get like a nice like clean chart like this, and it gives you, it makes you feel like, oh, okay, like yeah, like there's opportunities I can see here even within this chart. Google could probably increase, but I'm more interested actually in all the other stuff. What are all the other places that maybe we're not thinking of? So anyway, so that's just another example. We actually have to measure this, which if you're groaning like, no, I don't want to do this, I feel you, but I promise you that if you were to go through this effort, you would find things that you just didn't even consider before. And you would also start to think pretty critically about where you put, what eggs you put in what baskets. And I think that that's the other really fun part about this process. Oh, and also like pro tip. So we actually use SparkToro, spoilers. We actually use SparkToro for helping companies figure out like what opportunities and channels, like what hidden gem opportunities for all the stuff that you hear from customers and also from your own just Googling research, et cetera. We actually run pretty much all of those ideas through SparkToro. And then we get even more ideas, especially if we're feeling lean. And then other times, sometimes, in the event of, I think I gave the example of like we did like 50 interviews and we had like this huge chart full of all these opportunities. We picked the ones that we thought were the most interesting, and we ran them through SparkToro and found other sources of influence, and we used that to actually craft the go-to-market strategy for this particular client. And that's I think the beauty of this process. In addition, of course, to finding growth opportunities. But okay, so I mentioned charting all of this. The ultimate goal at this point is, if acquisition is the thing that you are struggling the most with, I started with it's getting more expensive than ever to acquire customers. So we either need to find different channels or we need to find different sources of influence, and then find a way to actually participate in those sources of influence in a way that's valuable. And of course, like our target market is in. So if you go through this process, you will naturally, well, you're going to have a ton of ideas. Um, I highly recommend not just documenting them, but actually then prioritizing them. So a lot of the things that you're going to come across, sometimes there are paid opportunities. So for example, newsletters. There's also sometimes like you can pay to sponsor like a particular podcast, or pay to sponsor a webinar, or pay to sponsor something. And then sometimes it's not about, maybe you don't pay, but maybe it's a scenario where if you build a good enough relationship within a particular community, you can speak for free, or you can participate in like an event or some other. You just be surprised at the opportunities that come up. And I think some of the most lucrative opportunities that we see for our clients are the ones where it's not just a purely transactional thing, like it's not just pay to play. It's they find sources that they can build real influence in, and I think that that's part of the acquisition process. But okay, so last up, I know we're dangerously close to time, so I'll try to get through this last piece as quickly as I can. But okay, if we go through customer research, we're probably asking acquisition related questions, but we're also probably asking about some of those other contextual pieces. So, for example, what led you to discover this particular product? Like, what was going on in your world that led you to consider DemandMaven, or led you to consider uplisting, or whatever it is? And sometimes you get answers, though, that as a marketer and also potentially as a growth strategist, you just cannot ignore. Um, Research is extremely eye opening. Yes, it'll give you ideas for new channels and places to explore, but it's also going to give you other information that you as marketers can act on, and or you can give to your product team, give to your sales team, give to your customer success team to also act on. The power of VOC is incredible, especially if you go through a process like this. But usually whenever we do research, the client will usually have a challenge like, oh, we don't get enough customers and we think it's because of acquisition. And we'll say, okay, great. We go through the process of research, but sometimes we'll actually find that there's other gaps. Yes, related to acquisition, but also related to retention, related to activation. You'd be surprised at just what comes up. Um, I don't know if I'll have enough time to give this story justice, but April Dunford is she's an incredible speaker. She wrote the book about positioning, obviously awesome. I highly recommend to read if you haven't. She gave this talk last year. I've seen this talk a bunch of times because we spoke at a lot of the same conferences last year. But she gave this incredible talk about how to craft a story that sells. And she actually talks about the process of buying a toilet. And I'm not going to do this talk justice. I'm just going to give you the link to go to watch it because it's amazing, it's hilarious, and I don't want to spoil any of her incredible jokes. But something that she said in her talk was that most people feel like selling is hard, but actually being a buyer is hard. And the entire talk is about the process of buying and how we can actually make buying easier. And what I think is so interesting about this talk is it kind of flips the narrative on the head a little bit. I think we as marketers are like, man, marketing is so hard, selling is so hard. And I totally agree. I think as customers, though, buying is also really hard. And there's a link to her talk on this slide. Highly recommend you go and watch. It's incredible. Your mind will be blown. But what I take away from this last step is it's if we're going to close the gap, it's really all about how do we make it easier for people to buy. So when I'm interviewing customers, when I'm collecting VOC data, I'm looking for moments of friction, and I'm looking for moments that are ultimately gaps, like what's preventing people from buying. Our approach to sustainable growth ultimately starts with customers. We start with the best leading indicator of growth, which are ultimately customers at the end of the day. We then will identify blockers or gaps in that growth, and we'll then design projects, campaigns, processes to close gaps. As marketers, of course, like we're going to be looking at campaigns and also channel opportunities, but we can also look at experiences. So, for example, I mentioned this already, but doing customer research does give you insight into other growth opportunities. The example I want to give is actually a client that we're still working with today. They are called Uplisting, and they're a vacation rental software platform. Don't have enough time to get into all the details about like who they are, what they do, but you can think about it like imagine you are an Airbnb owner, or you have several Airbnb locations, and you have different vacation rentals that people can rent through different channels. And you get to a place to where you're managing all these different properties. You need a channel manager to manage the properties, the prices, and the listings across all the different channels. And that's where you would consider a platform like Uplisting. When we did research for Uplisting, this was at the beginning of the pandemic, so the beginning of 2020. When we did research for them, we heard all kinds of things. And this is just like a summary of what we heard, but we heard that customers were choosing Uplisting after competitors. So Uplisting was usually like number 2 or 3. And the other thing that we heard was that competitors had better marketing. Like they had like shinier, prettier websites, shinier, prettier things. We also heard that Uplisting, it was like they chose Uplisting because it didn't give them like data issues. It didn't give them double bookings, which was really expensive and painful to fix. And then also, I mentioned earlier, like we also heard that Uplisting was something that they would try only after trying 2 to 3 other platforms. So they would try a competitor, live with that for a while, then try competitor number 2, sometimes try competitor number 3, and then they would get to Uplisting, which was mind blowing because we're basically like, wow, like we're like we're not the prettiest girl at the school, and like we're number 3 and number 4. So it was kind of like a double whammy. And from a marketing perspective, that told me, gosh, there's like a ton of opportunities even within this. So we completely overhauled the website. One, this is what it looked like before. We then moved into this. So visually speaking, we just made sure that we stood out visually and we didn't kind of blend across all the competitors. And then also because like brand was certainly something that we needed to update, but also the onboarding experience wasn't as great. And I think the last thing was positioning and messaging. Positioning and messaging were also off. Being only number 3 to 4 to even get to try kind of meant that like we weren't standing out, people weren't getting it. And for whatever reason, they had this perception that other competitors had better products. They had shinier, prettier marketing, even though we knew that the products weren't actually better. So this before and after experience, I gave all of this VOC data to the product team, to the customer success team, to the founders, and they were like, oh crap, we got some things to overhaul. But then on the marketing side, I made a very big case for we got to overhaul the brand. We also probably need to think about the actual website experience. When people land on the website, are they actually getting it, or are they kind of feeling like we just look like all the others? And this was a marketing project for sure. But yeah, that was part of what we did for them. And the results that we got from this, so we saw a 20% increase in activation rate. And this was part the work that we did, but also part giving this data to other people to then act on. We also saw a 3x lift in new signups. And we're actually still working with this company today on growth, but we also saw a 10x lift in MRR, which was pretty incredible due to many different things, of course. But a huge part of that was going through this first process of talking to customers, hearing what the pain points were, and then creating projects, campaigns, and activities and do to of course change the path, change the narrative. And that's what we got to see from that. Okay, that was all I had. I'm totally cool to stick around for questions if we have any.
That was awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
I went quiet for big parts of it because I was taking lots of notes.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no, that was a lot. But I'm very much a believer in customer research has so much. It has so much to give to our practice as marketers, as growth advisors, experts, etc. And there's so many different ways that you can collect it too. But anyway, happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. And in the meantime, thanks again. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for being so generous with your time, Asia. There were a couple questions in the chat. I think the one okay. There was one from Atlas. It was, I believe this was about customer interviews, maybe. But this, they asked, this might be a question for the very end, but would this apply to something that is more of an emotional style, like an emotional or style-based product like clothing versus a product or service that solves a problem?
Yes, great question. 100%. So there is actually I have a slide for this. Okay, so when it comes to customer research, at the beginning I mentioned ask jobs to be done style questions. And if you're unfamiliar with jobs to be done, I definitely recommend giving it a read. I saw some links flying around. So the concept of jobs is customers are ultimately hiring a product or service to make progress in something. Sometimes it's killing a pain, so being a painkiller, solving a problem, but sometimes it's also fulfilling a desire, fulfilling a need, a want. So for example, when I think about fashion isn't necessarily solving problems, it's fulfilling desires. It's fulfilling this need to make something beautiful, to make something exclusive, but also to make something, it's art. So why do we create art? It might be to solve a problem. So for example, if I don't make art, I go crazy. But maybe it's also to fulfill a desire. I want to make something beautiful. I want to create something that no one else has ever created because no one else can, because no one else is me. Only I am me. So maybe I want to create something unique or special. That's still a job. And so, yes, this sense still applies to even if you have something that fulfills a desire versus maybe solving a pain. Although you might be surprised because sometimes this happens a lot. Sometimes people find that they think that they're fulfilling a desire, but they actually are solving a pain when they actually talk to customers. So you might be surprised that it might be you might change your mind actually after talking to customers. And then sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes they're like, oh yeah, we're solving this massive problem, massive pain, but actually they're fulfilling a desire. And so that can happen. This process works for enterprise, CPG, consumer packaged goods companies, but this process also works for small business services companies like us. It works for startups. It works for literally everyone because everyone buys something for a reason. It's just figuring out like what that reason is and what the context is. But that's what jobs is all about.
And using clothes as an example, I have a top of mind example of a jobs to be done thing with clothes. Like I'm currently pregnant and I bought like a maternity jumper on Amazon. And so for me, at least how I describe it is this was very much jobs to be done. Like if I want like a beautiful piece of clothing that will stand the test of time, I don't go to Amazon. But for this, I did because I was like, I'm only going to be pregnant for like, I don't know, 5 or 6 months longer. So I don't need this to be super high quality. I like it to be cheap, and I just want something comfortable that I like don't feel gross in. Like, and I need it to be good for warm weather. Like total jobs to be done, right? Need to fit me, need to be cheap, need to be for this season. I don't care how long it lasts, right? So
Totally.
yeah. Cool. There are other questions that I wanted to
Ooh.
flag. Okay. So Jared asks, thank you for all this great content. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile the difference between what people actually do versus what they say they do?
Mm. Okay, so this is a great question. And I actually was just reading an article about this. Okay, so here's the thing: most people, generally speaking, aren't going to be great at predicting behavior, aka like what they would do, like what would you like what like I think I gave the example, which looking back probably was a poor example, but I gave the example of like back in the day when I had to like attend sales demos to get voice of customer, and they're like, okay, it's like, what would you prefer, video or like written ebook guides or whatever on like how to onboard and how to use the product? And what I should have asked instead of saying like, what would you prefer, is okay, so when you've onboarded for other like really complex products, what have you like, how did you get onboarded? What was that process like? And what made that process great and like what made that process not great? And those are a lot of questions, but the answers would give you more of the truth. Now, the truth does like you'll never get 100% the truth, but the goal is to get 70 to 80% of the way. If you ask people what they would do, you're going to get like 20 to 30% because most people are very optimistic about what they would accomplish or what they would choose or what they would buy or not buy or what they would use. But they're much better at telling you at least like what did happen. And if the more that you interview, the more that you are going to also be able to detect when something is vague and when you need to dig deeper and ask follow-up questions. And you'll also be able to detect when like you're missing information. And this comes with practice. The first few, I'm going to say like the first like 3 to 5 interviews you ever do ever, if you've never done them before, they're going to be awkward. They're going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to like lead the customer and like you're going to bias yourselves. And that's just part of the process. But the more that you learn about how to interview, the more that you will just, you are going to improve on of like, oh, I've noticed customers continue to react this way whenever I ask this question. Maybe I need to change the question or I need to like dig deeper into the answers. There's a really good book. It's not for the faint of heart. It is a very easy read though. It's really more for founders who are conducting like product interviews, but it's still really helpful to identify bias. But it's called The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick. It is an incredible book. Even like marketers will definitely get value out of this, even though it's not 100% focused on interviewing from a marketing perspective. It will still teach you how to interview in a way that enables you to, well, one, not bias yourself, but also to detect when you need to dig deeper and also like how much you can trust a customer's answer. It's a very like the first, you don't even have to read the whole book. It's like the first 1 to 3 chapters, I think, are like really, really good at giving you solid examples. Um, but maybe that's an article I should write in the future.
Yeah,
Also,
I think so.
yeah,
Cool. Maybe one last question.
sure.
Cool. Maria asks, okay, how do you pick which answers or cited discovery habits are most interesting or worth analyzing further, especially when you have a large volume of responses?
Mm, yeah, I went through this just recently where we sent out a survey to. I completely forgot to put surveys in here too. Dang. Okay, that's another option if you can't run interviews. I completely forgot about surveys. You can also do website surveys too. Yeah, so we we ran a survey for a client and we were thinking, oh, haha, we're only going to get like 50 responses. And we got like 350 responses. And me and my team, we were just like, oh my God, we're going to die. Because we had all this data analyzed. It's really fun though. I love this part. But yeah, we got tons of answers on the discovery habits and the channel opportunities piece. And what I determined to be interesting is knowing the context of the business. And I think that knowing like what your business is, like what your budgets are, like that information, I do think influences how you think about the opportunities that you arrive at. When I'm thinking about what's interesting or like what we should prioritize, I'm thinking about, okay, you're going to get the same stuff across the board. You're going to get Google. Like Google's going to pop up everywhere. You're going to get like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. And those are all super valid answers. Obviously because customers are replying with them. But what I look for is, okay, if I know CAC is increasing and it's getting more and more expensive, I'm looking at, yes, paid acquisition is great. Depending on the company, it's going to make more sense for some than others. Depending on the budget you have, it's going to make more sense for some than others. But I look for entry points of where I think we can most like enter, like where can we, like where should we really put our eggs in terms of building influence, and where can we like just test different ideas. So if I have a paid acquisition budget, or if I have a paid media budget in general, maybe I want to try sponsoring a few newsletters. Maybe there's also a couple of conferences that I'm going to try to see if the company can like build relationships with, and maybe there's also like a few like other like co-marketing opportunities that we can suss out, and or partnerships. I'm basically just kind of like looking for, where are there potential doors open, where can we potentially provide the most value. And that's what, when I say interesting, like that's what I really mean, of like, oh, these are interesting because it seems like there's like a door that's here that's open. There's also going to be some that are just like, I don't know, maybe they're closed doors to me because getting into them is actually really hard. But like you're going to hear like TechCrunch and the New York Times and like really big media stuff that maybe that's possible for you guys to access, but maybe it's super not. And so you're like, okay, that's not as interesting to me. Um, but just because I know like the team isn't going to actually be able to do anything there within the context that we're in. Now, if we had this PR firm that was like, we could get you into TechCrunch, I'd be like, dope, let's do it. But if that's not available to us, I'm just not going to spend energy there. So that's what I mean by interesting, and how I think about prioritizing is there an opportunity for us to provide value? Is there an opportunity for us to participate? And if those two boxes aren't checked, then it's kind of a non sequitur. It's mum, I think.
Totally makes sense. I know you have to hop. I do too. Asia, where can people find you, reach out to you if you want to be reached out to?
Yeah, please. Okay, so you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. If you do, just make sure that you put in the invite like box or whatever that you met me through this. I get tons
Mm.
and tons and tons of connection requests, and the ones that I accept are the ones that have like that little blurb of like, I saw you on SparkToro's thing or whatever. There's also Twitter. I am at Asia Orangio. There's also DemandMaven.io. And yeah, those are the three top places. But yes, please reach out, ask questions. I'm here for it. And yeah, let me know if there's anything else I can do to be of service.
Awesome. And low key, amazing tip for like cold DMs. Like, hey, heard about you on this. Then it
Yep,
automatically does not look like spam.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yes, please do. Would love to meet everyone.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much for your time and energy, Asia. And thank you, friends, for joining us. Of course, you're going to get the replay and the slides and hopefully a blog post very, very soon, today or tomorrow. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Likewise. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.